episode of Xero Cafe. A challenge that we've all faced with when trying to understand customer behavior is that the data just isn't quite there yet, and it's also a challenge to make it viable for commercial use. But, and since you're listening to this podcast, you're probably very much aware that these insights into purchasing behavior is a key to business success. This is where John Poulsen comes in. He is the Vice President of Innovation at the data insights and consulting company Kantar, and he's a multi-award winning market researcher known worldwide for his thought leadership and new perspectives on the way in which we conduct user research and product research. I spoke with him at the beginning of February at a conference, and we spoke about his recent paper on developing a more robust measurement tool that can provide a clear picture of human decision making at scale, as well as the techniques he learned along the way that can be applied in a wider world of research. So this is the audio recording of that live session. If you want, you can also view the live video recording of my talk with John when you head over to xero.cafe/YouTube. My name is Giri Jansen and welcome to Xero Cafe, the podcast where I show you the behind the scenes of optimization teams and talk with their specialists about data and human-driven optimization and implementing a culture of experimentation and validation. This episode of Xero Cafe is made possible by our partners Online Dialogue, Sitespect, Content Square and Convert.com. So thank you so much for joining us, even on 1 hour sleep.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, just mentioned that A/B testing is basically what you do, so that's perfect topic for Xero Cafe podcast. You have a session this afternoon at the ME conference, The Real Why and Hidden Who. Yep. So let's start with that. What's your session about?
It's some work we've been doing with a colleague of mine in WPP at Ogilvy called Christopher Grace, who's a very flamboyant character, and Ogilvy have got quite an advanced viewpoint on using behavioural science in communication planning, and they're very interested in understanding human decision-making processes, how people think, and linked to things like people's personality and how they see the world and so on. And the paper's about the story that the journey we went on to try and work out a better way of measuring all that in traditional market research, because it's actually quite a challenge to measure just the basics of people's personality.
It's not as easy as MBTI.
No.
He tries to slip in MBTI whenever he gets the opportunity.
And then tell how bad it is.
Yes. I mean, there's lots of challenges on lots of levels, and the paper that we've published around the methodology, it's worth anyone reading to get hold of a copy. It just tells the series of experiments that we undertook to try and explore better ways of getting people to really reveal who they are and how they think, and trying to overcome some of the frailties in that process, and some of the classical ways that people measure personality in particular are fraught with error. And we sort of dismantled some of the classical techniques and then try to stick them back together again using different approaches.
So what are those findings?
Well, in a nutshell, if you were to say the biggest challenge when I'm trying to measure, say, your personality in particular is self-assessment bias. Yeah. I mean, most personality as function of things like, how agreeable you are. And very few people are going to admit that they're not very agreeable. Or, this level of conscientiousness is one of the classical big five personality traits. No one admits to being unconscientious, disorganized. People just refuse to acknowledge that they are. And so you
need to develop a question that somehow people can answer honestly without being
because this. Yeah, because it's viewed as negative trait.
So what we were able to demonstrate was how that completely corrupts a personality test, because what you get is everyone's in the top half of some of the
persons in the world.
Yeah, everyone likes it. So what we developed quite a lot of interesting techniques to try and resolve that, simply by making people aware of their biases. We found actually quite effective. We used the grumpy cat meme. It was the most effective thing we were trying to work out how to get people conscious in a nice, friendly way about the fact that people, aren't very self-reflective about some things. So we showed the grumpy cat.
I'm happy.
And then asked people to tell us some of their, how they feel they are compared to other people. And we doubled the amount of moodiness, for example, out of people when they were exposed to that type of thing. We also discovered that people are able to more objectively look at their past, their youth, their growing up period more than their now. So I'm not going to admit that I'm commonly late for meetings, but I'm prepared to admit that I was late for school. Yeah. And so what we realised is that navigating through to the past was a good way of, and a lot of our personality is established in our teenage years and so on. So quite a good, rich way to mine, real behaviour out of the past, where people are able to sort of process it. And
so basically by having people tell you about their behaviour from the past, it's a lot better indicator of what they will do in the future.
It can be, yes.
But we also know that memory is not the best.
Yeah. For example, one of the interesting we do. I mean, for example, to predict whether you're a smoker or not, it's got a lot of personality traits linked to that. One of the most revealing questions that you could ask is, when you're growing up, did you cross the line much with your family or your parents or school? And the people that readily admit to that are 35% more likely to be a smoker. Because you can understand where that's coming from. They pushed things, and one of the things they went into, what they ended up smoking is on the back of that. And that's a good example of how a small facet of your personality can have quite significant implications to your life, in a sense. We also discovered that we're always, if you ask people how good are you at a job, everyone's better than average.
Yeah. Same as driving. Yeah. It's fame.
But if I were to say,
can you point someone out in the office?
How argumentative are you compared to your brother? I might be a little bit more prepared to admit that I'm quite, or compared to near-field family members, I can be a little bit more honest about who what I'm actually like than the general. And what we found is that by asking people to think about themselves in the context of a real tangible people they know, their family, they were able to be a little bit more honest. And I think the biggest leap forward was when we started to almost break down the problem into little bite-sized chunks. So I'm not going to say I'm disorganised, but I might be prepared to admit that my bedroom drawers are a bit messy. And I could ask you, when do you do the washing up, straight away, or do you leave it a bit? Or I might say, how do you park? Do you just drive straight in, or do you sort of think about it and reverse park in? Yeah. Those little sort of, we can be honest about those, and in themselves, they're not going to be. It's a bit unfair to.
It doesn't feel like it's I can answer it honestly. It doesn't feel like it's too personal.
Yeah, and so you add up those tiny little clues together, and you get actually quite a more reliable assessment of someone's core in each. And so what we did was literally we deconstructed every one of the big 5 personality traits, and literally we tested out for each of those personality dimensions. We tested out hundreds of behavioural-based little indicator-type questions, and then we did technical principal component analysis to pick apart and isolate the things that are most revealing of each of the primary personality traits that people could answer most honestly. And then the survey's made up of lots of little questions like that people actually quite enjoy answering in a funny sort of way, because you can just bring it to life a little bit. They're more human-based questions.
If you get a question like, do you park right in the front or backwards, it's like, why would they ask this? But sure, I have no idea what they can conclude from this, but actually you can if you add it up.
A tiny little clue. I mean, you can overinterpret some of these things, and so. That was one nice breakthrough, that we were able to really demonstrate that we could be a bit more rounded. And then what we discovered is that...
how many questions did you end up with?
Well, we
100,000.
Well, for the big 5 personality traits, there's 5 primary personalities. I think we did 5 more than 5. We probably did about 20 experiments, and we might test out a batch of 50 or 70 questions for each of them, and then you whittle them down and. It would be literally A/B testing in a sense. You'd be testing out all these different approaches, then working out which is the most reliable and which is the most comprehensive. There's lots of subtleties to it, because a lot of these questions, you realise how dominated your white Western sort of humanity, my perspective on the world. We wanted to develop a test that works in lots of different languages and lots of different cultures. And the first raft of our questions had a whole lot of stuff about recycling, because we discovered was really revealing about your levels of conscientiousness, whether you can be bothered to recycle. It's just a really good indicator. And then we tested it out in various different countries and discovered that in most parts of Asia, no one recycles, and so you can't. Those questions are precluded.
Yeah.
And when you deconstruct a lot of the personality tests, scarily American Western cultured bias the questions just simply don't translate across culture. So there's one
that's a problem with a lot of psychology social research.
So there was one particular element of personality we were interested in, is measuring people's attitudes towards risk taking. And you take a lot of the it's called regulatory control. You take a lot of the classical tests and you start looking at the questions. It's like what's your attitude to whitewater rafting or skydiving? And you can imagine a retired lady in Singapore asking her that. I mean, it just doesn't mean anything. So that was one of the challenges, trying to think of things that could transcend culture and were stable from one culture to another. Anyway, to tackle that, the other real, I think probably evolutionary step we discovered is that if you ask all these personality tests side by side, you start to realise that they're all a little bit interwoven. So, and the different cognitive thinking style techniques, the different ways that we think, they're all, as our brains are a mash-up of lots of different factors. All these different tests often have very similar questions. And what we discovered is that if you take out the core constitutional parts of each personality framework you want to measure and measure them all side by side, they start to inform each other, and you could use the results from one part of the test to validate another part of the test. And when you start doing that, you might to measure conscientiousness, I can actually validate it from maybe 20 or 30 data points from other parts of the other personality framework questions. They start to introduce a degree of like blockchain style stability, because I'm not reliant on one particular thing to determine your whole personality measure. It's made up of lots of little ticks here. So if one particular factor doesn't particularly cross culture, that doesn't fall over my personality assessment. So what we found is by combining multiple measures into one survey actually gave us a great deal of stability and cross-correlation around cultures was higher than we were finding with some of the traditional techniques. So having like an Uber measurement protocol, when we think about what we developed as a measure of essentially the big 5 personalities, but a range of cognitive thinking styles, which things like locus of control, my sense of control I feel I have in my life. And the people that feel like they've got a lot of control over their life actually tend to be slightly more conscientious as well.
So is it like you have I don't know what the English term is, but you have some things you can slide, and if you slide that one a lot to the right, then the other one automatically goes a little to the left. Sort of that idea.
They're interrelated. Everything, and we take every scrap of detail from just actually the way you use the scale is an indicator of certain personality types. So some people use the far a lot more enthusiastic in the way that they use scales. Other people are very measured, and that correlates with regulatory control. I mean, risk takers tend to, and they will answer quicker, and they will, and and so those that metadata we also weave into our assessment. Actually,
that's how a lot of psychology tests at university also go through. They tell you it's about something, it's usually about something else. And then like say, it's not about the questions itself; it's about how fast you, how extreme you answer or something. That's fun.
And then the final part of the story, I suppose, is the way that what we realise is that if you've ever taken a personality test, it's essentially 40 or 50 agree-disagree statements, and it just drives you nuts after a while, and you get really bored doing it. And what we're able to observe is after about the 10th time you're asked to agree or disagree, people just start to patternise their answers, and you start to lose concentration. And so what we put a lot of thought in is to how to keep people's attention going over the course, so maintaining that. And what we did is we broke the survey up into what we call thinking chunks of about 3 minutes of thinking, and we themed them each in a sense around a sort of a construct. And then what we did is at the beginning of each thinking chunk we'd have what's called a thought starter, something that would like arrest their attention a bit. So we had
if you win €1 million, what would you do?
Spend it on? Exactly. Would you? We actually have a question in the survey. It basically says, if you won £100,000, or would you rather take the money or get slightly more money and have it only £1,000 a month, or do you want all the money up front, or do you want it in piecemeal? And that's it's a fun question to think about. What do I want? But that actually does reveal people's future planning protocols. So we would have little questions like that. We had like a question like, if the Queen you found out was coming to tea, how long would it take to tidy up your house?
All right,
and if they say, "Oh shit, I'm going to need a few hours," then other people say, "No,
it would be easier just to rent another house."
A lot of people say, "No, my house is fine. You can come around right away." So it's really, I got a bit of assessment of, and then we would ask a whole lot of questions around that sort of theme about your house, your home, or whatever, and then at the end of each little chunk, we give them live feedback about what we'd learned. So, you are this type of, like and we developed this sort of like slider scale, some visuals and stuff. You're this type of person, or that type of person. And so what they felt is it was worth their effort, each little bit, because they'd start to learn that they were going to get something out, they'd find something out about themselves as they went through it, rather than right through to the end. But it's a bit too late to engage them. And boy, did that have an impact on improving concentration. We were able to do some test and control experiments where we stripped out those elements of feedback, and the people were giving feedback like that. We were seeing about a 40% increase in thinking time address overall. And so that was just so the paper just tells all this, what we did, all these different techniques. So many of the techniques that we did develop actually could be applied in all sorts of different dimensions of research. So, I think that it was some good general learning. I think that's why people like the paper, because everyone can read it and take something out of it.
But does that
loads of spin-off methodologies on the back of it?
But does that imply that all the personality tests we have up till now are useless or very inaccurate?
Yes.
Does your research show that?
They're long. To pin down the errors, they have to be long. And so they're inefficient, I'd say. I wouldn't want to do, Big Five methodologies, it's 40 years old, pretty well established, but to measure properly each personality dimension, the long form is is 40 or 50 questions per personality. Simply impractical to do that at scale. So it's more to do with the inefficiency that I think we've closed off, and because all those tests inherently have lots of sort of things I'm talked about, but just done in a slightly perhaps less sophisticated way. Perhaps.
And I think the Big Five. So the skills you use are based on the Big Five, right?
Well, there's more to tell about that, because what we realised is that a lot of the Big Five constructs are very academic and really don't translate very well into commercial decision making. So what we did is we actually tried to transpose those measures into something that's a bit more commercially useful. So
you might find out during research, it's actually not 5 dimensions but 6 or 4 that are useful.
The Big Five is just the architecture. Beneath that there's like loads of sub dimensions. A good example would be openness. Mm-hmm. Now, we did this project for Ogilvy. They had a behavioural economic theory that people who were trying to lose weight were one of the facets that they were open.
Okay.
And their reasoning was that they were open. Therefore, if I say, "Would you like a bar of chocolate?" you say yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in actual fact, openness in the classical academic measure is a measure of intellectual curiosity. It's not quite the same as open to suggestion.
No.
And
it could be the exact opposite.
Yeah. And so those two things are being confused just by the language. And so what we realise is that a lot of these tests, conscientiousness as well, is like a general construct that actually has 3 independent variables, I suppose, that are really important to understand. Is that it's a confluence of fastidiousness, and the primary questions in the classical test ask things like how good your spelling is.
Yeah.
But it's also about how goal-driven you are, and which is different. I can be a really goal-driven individual where I'm really conscious. I'm going to win this thing. I'm going to go and do it, and I leave a lot of mess along the way, and I'm not very fastidious about the detail. And then you've got another person who's very careful about, and the classical test is more focusing on the careful and doesn't take into account this group of people who, in many respects, you look on as being very conscientious. They really, they work hard, stay in the office late to try and get things done, but they may rush over some of the detail. And then there's another element of it, which is level of organisation. And again, that doesn't necessarily. I can be very organised, and therefore I don't have to rush to get, and that the result of that, I think about paying my bills on time and stuff like that. So,
and like you just said, it's in the old test, it's all self-reporting. So you're not actually testing how organized are you, but how organized are you compared to your image of a person that's being self-organized.
And so a measure of conscientiousness is almost useless for me as a market researcher. I need to know the sub-facets of that to be able to do something with. So what our personality measurement framework is actually made up of the primary ones, but some sub-dimensions that we think are important for market research decision making. So it's built around that language because everyone understands what the Big Five are, but I'm more interested in actually some of the sub-dimensions. So.
And then the question indeed is, what can we do with it as a commercial company? We spoke yesterday with was the gaming company. They together with Sanoma, and also they had this 2-dimensional scale for images, and they had a big image data bank, and they have different magazines. So which image represents best or works best, speaks to the audience of a certain magazine, and they created this machine learning /AI system to use this huge data bank of images and put it in one of those 4 boxes which fits a certain audience of a certain
to basically
magazine.
Help themselves and advertisers predict what image would work best on which
So how can we use this?
Exactly the same sort of idea is that actually we've done loads and loads of follow-on work where you might show people different advertising messages and look at which personality groups each message appeals to, and what you can see is quite distinctive differential appeal between just subtle changes sometimes in a message. It have more resonant with more different subgenres of people based upon their personality. So what the root of the Ogilvy methodology for developing any form of marketing communication is trying to understand the behavioural science of the decision and how people think about it, what are the emotional roots to that process. And so the test measures that. So what they can then do is apply theories to communication development, strategy development. And that's essentially where we've had some really great early wins in doing that. And so, for example, we did this fantastic piece of work where we tried to deconstruct the personality of people trying to give up smoking. And we identified some of the core group of people struggling to give up smoking had they struggle to process emotions a bit, and they're using smoking as a bit of a timeout for an emotional break. They were incredibly fatalistic. They had
what is fatalist?
They were they felt the world controlled them. They didn't really control them. They didn't have a sense that they could actually give up smoking with their own internal motivations.
Right.
They'd given up that they had what's called an external locus of control. They felt that
they should be the worst, I guess.
Yeah, things would happen that they didn't have much control
regardless of what
over.
they
so
do.
There's nothing much I could do to give up. Okay, and then we also discovered that they were what's called promotion orientated, and that they had a sort of, it's not just risk taking, is that they were sort of go-getting, goal orientated and a bit rebellious. I mean, that's the root of going into smoking. It's got an association with rebelliousness. And then the most critical thing was that their avoidance of negative emotion. And the way they use smoking to process that. And then you start to look at your typical anti-smoking ad, and it's just like a picture of someone dying of cancer. And we did some really interesting experiments where we show people ads, just random ads, and then we drop in one of these anti-smoking messages and compared how smokers and non-smokers reacted to them. And essentially, the non-smokers just clicked the next button, and we timed how long they would look at them, and they were literally clicking the next button almost twice as, or 50% faster than the smokers, because it was setting off alarm bells internally. And so the way they were dealing with those negative emotions was to blank it out almost. And so it's not to say that those sorts of messages are not effective at certain groups of people to encourage them to give up smoking, but this hardcore group of people really struggle to process that, and the way they do it is just like, oh no, don't tell me.
So the question is, it's a good ad for non-smokers, but it's a bad ad for smokers.
On websites we talk about banner blindness. It's something similar. You learn to ignore certain.
So what we then to do, we are trying to then build from the ground up a different approach to communicating the opportunity to give up smoking. Around solutions, around what we call external locus of control reasons for giving up, like you're getting married or you've just had a grandchild. These are wonderful external motivators to give up smoking, and showing people achieving those moments in life where people were able to actually actively achieve giving up smoking seeds the opportunity in their minds of someone. And then for capturing this idea that the promotion-orientated mindset, we developed some messaging around positioning giving up smoking as a bit of a challenge that these people had overcome, and fuck you, I gave up smoking. It's sort of like a really sort of like
the rebellious, but then the other way around.
Yeah, reverse engineer, and then the fatalism of it all. We developed some messaging around tomorrow's the day sort of thing. And then what we did is exactly the same thing. We showed people serious about drop these ads in, and what we're finding is that non-smokers, these ads are kind of wallpaper. There was no registered difference, but the smokers were pausing and looking at them, and we realised that we were connecting. They were connecting, and so I mean it's difficult to know whether but it's a good example of how by really understanding the underlying personality traits and how people think is a really brilliant starting point for developing better forms of communication and really I think that it's revolutionises how you think about developing advertising communication, and that's really what Ogilvy have really pioneered, and they really are pioneers of that methodology. That Ogilvy Centre for Behavioural Science is really driving forward their business, and what hopefully this test does is give them a platform to be able to implement that more effectively by actually having a proper framework to measure a theory, because up until now it's I have a construct. I need to be able to measure whether it's true or not before I press ahead with spending loads of money on the advertising.
It also sounds a bit like you're chasing a moving target almost. Like with I think when I read the book from Erin Meyer about culture, what really resonated with me is that she said, okay, culture in itself isn't something. I mean, it's always relative to another culture. I think it's very similar with personality. Personality in itself doesn't mean anything unless you compare it to something else.
At least one other
That's
person.
why we have those skills. And like you said, smoking relates to being rebellious. But I think 70 years ago, probably not.
It was the norm.
It was socially acceptable.
So how often should you be revising this personality test?
I think that you could think about there's a whole area of situational relevance to some of the stuff as well, because my level of conscientiousness will vary. I'm in a supermarket buying a washing powder, compared to buying a car. My level of conscientiousness, that's probably more significant. Situational factors and trying to understand the situational personality variance as much as, and in a sense, that's what. Time is a situational factor in a moving decision-making framework. I mean, the core personality traits are the same this time as 50 years ago, but the situation of buying and choosing cigarettes has moved on, and therefore you need to understand that.
Yeah.
It's really important to understand the situational framework and what you're trying to measure, and then often what we've discovered is actually our personality test is a starting point. You probably sometimes have to bolt on extra little things to understand other little facets. So, for example, we've done a lot of work in the healthcare sector. There's this thing called optimism bias that's really dominant in your likelihood to take treatment options up seriously. Is literally whether you think you're invincible or not, whether you think that you're vulnerable to, and you can see it with people's. Say, for example, diabetic stage 2 before they develop was it? I don't know what.
One is before. 2 is when you can't get rid of it anymore.
The early stages, and what you.
Luckily, I don't know this.
If you look at measure people's optimism bias, and you can measure it with a cluster of questions. It correlates with their likelihood of actually taking the action to do anything, go out and doing some exercise or responding to that thing, and so. In particular, we found that personality is really important to understand for how healthcare applications and likelihood of taking treatments and avenues for encouraging people to take up treatments. The relationship with their emotions and how they respond to different types of messages. Some people really block out emotional advertising messaging that are too strong, and other people respond to more of the practical aspects of it, and they want solutions. And other people have like a barrier to their confidence of getting over that first thing, the first step. They don't feel that. So,
it's fascinating.
Yeah.
So
you get lost in a little bit.
When applying this, for example, to buying behavior. When I give presentations and I talk about, you have also the experience of that person might vary. Have a big impact on their expert level on buying something. Like, for example, I'm the expert of buying wine. Yeah. Maybe I'm very influenceable, being influenced by whatever my friends do or whatever I buy. I look at my friends first. Yep. But when it comes to wine, I'm the expert.
Yeah.
So please go away, friends. You don't know nothing about this. I'm the wine expert. I'll tell you. I'm not going to listen to you anyway.
Yeah.
So, how far is personality a predictor for buying behavior? How much? It's not going to be 100%.
Obviously.
one of the things we've very specifically woven into our measure is the sort of hedonic framework with which you make decisions. So whether you're using your feelings to make decisions and what information you feel you need to make a decision. We've retooled regulatory control, sort of risk-taking thing. Actually, the questions we devised centered around how much information you need to make a decision. If you're buying a car, do you need to go and do some research for us, or do you just go down to the showroom and jump in a car and see what feels nice?
Yeah.
But what you've just identified is one of the sense of self-confidence in your own knowledge and your decision-making skills, and that will vary.
Yeah.
Some people have a lot more self-confidence, and it's one of the dimensions we mentioned. It's called locus of control. Your sense of self-confidence, your ability to make your own decisions,
which might be correct or not.
But it's incredibly situational.
Yeah.
So if I recognise that I know a lot about a topic, I'll rely on my own opinion. And if I'm not, am I the sort of person that would then seek advice? Or am I now the person that would want to go and still work it out for myself, but it would take more time to work out? And so that's it. You pinpointed, without that bit of information in a particular buying scenario, I'm a bit blind.
Yeah.
And so one of the things one of my biggest frustrations with all forms of generic segmentation, in the sense we've developed a generic segmentation model, is that you cannot just rely completely on that generic segmentation, saying all decisions can be flown and predicted out of this.
Yeah.
You always have to augment with some extra things that are relevant, situationally relevant to that particular thing. And I think you pinpointed a really good example of that.
Yeah, it's the famous saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yeah, but I do
need to keep
think
that in mind.
We're just. I like to think about these as lenses almost to look.
Yeah.
I mean, so one of Christopher Gray's, that's his language. It's saying they're just lenses to look at the world and give a different viewpoint of how to think about it. They're not answers. They're just sort of like ways to look at people.
Yeah, and I think it's also true that I think you can reverse your example as well. So somebody who usually thinks he's an expert, but specifically on wine, he listens to his friends.
Sure.
So as long as the buyer behavior lines up with
especially
with certain types, you can optimize for it, or at least try to optimize for it.
I mean, it's almost diverting a different field, but I've done a lot of work on social influence, and you realise how significant that
social proof.
Social. Well, the certain, in the past, you'd have fashion things like haircuts and clothing, music and stuff were deemed fashion driven. And that's basically a level of social exposure, because I can see your haircut, I can see 1 million people's haircuts every day. I know what's... and so those markets were subject to fashion changes. Other things like what wallpaper is in your living room, I'm not going to be so exposed to that. It's only when I go around to your house that I get to see. And so those types of choices, they're also fashion driven, but because on my exposure rate to your house, and so the virality of the fashion is very low on that, the fashion cycle's longer. And so you can actually plot it out. The more social exposure, the more churn you get of choice. And
really?
Then
awesome.
If you go down to something like boot polish, where it sits in your cupboard, you only get it out now, there's no social context. Interestingly, the number one boot polish brand 100 years ago is still the number one boot polish, because there's been no social influence driving, there's no fashion in that. Now what's happened with social basically social media has opened up the house to social exposure, and also it's opened up drinking occasions to a huge amount of social exposure. So now I'll post a picture of myself having a drink, and what we've been observing is that I'm a lot more comfortable sharing a photo of a cool brand of beer than a regular brand of beer. In fact, I did some analysis of, for example, whiskey.
Yeah.
If you scrape like 100 photographs of whiskey off Instagram, and then you look at the top 3 or 4 brands of whiskey. You won't see them at all in any of those pictures. They're all the obscure little...
It's not cool to
Yeah.
be with the majority.
And so that's the essence of fashion, is that no one wants to be mainstream. And so that fashion social influence is basically attacking all sorts of market sectors that once was pretty stable. And so the beer market is turning fashion driven. The life cycle of beer brands is dropping down to from maybe 5, 6, 10 years to down to 2 or 3, and maybe I suspect it's going to be,
faster and faster.
And so I think that's a really good example of a new thing you have to understand human decision making, is the influence of the social context and how it invades. And the home
awesome.
is particularly vulnerable to that. Really freaky things. For example, we discovered dogs.
I have a dog.
Dogs, the #1 social media accessory on Instagram.
Dogs and cats. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So dog sales have gone up. If you actually look at the rise of Instagram and the rise of dog ownership,
Yeah.
it's correlating.
Oh, that is awesome.
Yeah, and
Depends on how well they are taking care of the dogs. but-
Yeah.
another freaky one is Christmas decorations. In the old days, you have your Christmas decorations, so you get out your thing that's been in your family for generations, you put them on your Christmas tree. No one sees them, apart from your family. Now, whenever you put up your Christmas tree, you take a photograph of them. Next year I can't take a photograph of I photographed that last year. I need a new Christmas decoration. So literally Christmas decoration sales have literally just gone through, they've climbed about 30-40% year on year the last few years, because that desire to be able to show something new and fresh.
Yeah,
So-
my mom has the same color for 30 years, but she is not on Instagram. But,
That's the thing.
yeah.
Anyway, we're diversing.
Yeah, well,
And
it's
I've
so
got a
interesting.
presentation
Yeah,
to do.
yeah. So
What are you going to research next? What's next for you?
I'm particular. I talked to you about at the beginning about the grumpy cat.
Yeah.
We're in the midst of a whole load of experiments looking at how to get people to be more honestly declare certain things like environmental attitudes and stuff, which is really fascinating, because some things like your attitudes towards recycling and so on. So I mean, if you ask people straight up, do you do these things? What do you feel about this? Would you do this in the supermarket? Everyone says yes, and it's not true. And so we've been doing a whole load of experiments to try and understand how to motivate people to be more honest actually about their behaviour and what they would do in different situations, and I've got a fantastically smart intern working for me, and who's literally spent the last few weeks digging up these really wacky sort of meme type visuals. In fact, this fantastic animated meme of this woman going to throw a bag of rubbish into the recycling bin, and she swings it around, and it breaks just as it's, and it all spreads all over her. And we use that as a sort of the start of a dialogue, saying, we always some of us face challenges recycling, and that tiny bit of humour literally doubles the amount of people who are then prepared to open up and admit that they don't bother recycling.
Yeah,
Amazing, yeah.
that's awesome.
So we've been doing, we've had a lot of fun with that, actually.
So you're still gonna keep on basically improving what you found to make it better, more efficient.
We're looking at one of the other areas is income. Everyone says in a survey that they're rich.
Is that true?
Well, everyone inflates their wealth, and a wealth question.
Wealth and their height
has no correlation with wealth. Almost, certainly no correlation with disposable income.
Yeah.
So what we've been looking at, using the same idea of behavioural techniques, we've been trying to work out how do you measure. We're thinking about how to measure someone's disposable income by their behaviour. So, for example, do you take a packed lunch into work, or do you go out and buy it? Is a subtle tell about your level of disposable income. So try and piece together that type of thing. So that taking that thinking and applying it a different way to a different challenge is something that we're looking at doing. And we've had lots of spin-off methodologies come out of this work. So just sort of like exploring different things like that.
Awesome.
Cool.
Okay.
And the paper we spoke about at the beginning, where can people download that?
SMR, I'm here with at the invitation of SMR.
We just spoke to Joachim.
Yeah, we won the SMR Best Paper Award. So if you log on to SMR, if you're an SMR member, you can get it for free.
Yeah.
I think we bought a license set, so we can. If you're really polite to me, send me an email. I can give you.
We'll add your email address to the show notes of the podcast, and then.
But I mean, if you've watched this podcast, you've heard it all, so you don't need.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Good luck with your talk.
Yeah, have fun.
Okay. All right.
Have fun.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right,
Bye-bye.
see you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.